This is the second Sunday in a short 4-week series on peacemaking in an election season. If you were here last week, you heard Jay's introduction, and he did this by sharing some political musings and by a bit of a history lesson. So if you missed that, I encourage you to go back. I saw many people during service taking pictures of his PowerPoint because he really laid out these 5 historical approaches that Christians throughout time have taken as they respond to living in a world where there are governments and policies and oppression and people in charge. I appreciate so much what Jay shared, the knowledge he gave us, and it was a reminder for me again that there is often not one right way. That there were biblical passages that backed up each one of those approaches. There are people from the Bible and historical fathers and mothers of our faith that align themselves with each one of those approaches. And so for some of us, that's really freeing. And for some of us, we feel really lost because we want to be told, what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to react? And so I'm not going to give you those answers this morning. Because the longer I follow Jesus, the more I realize how much is unclear. There are things that need to be left up to discernment and to interpretation. And that's been a hard journey for me because I was, especially in my teenage years, I wanted there to be a right answer and I wanted to tell everyone what the right answer was. And so it has been definitely a journey of God with me to not only teach me that there's not a right answer, but to make that be freeing for me. That there are different ways to approach things that align with God's heart, and that's okay. And we actually need that diversity of approach. Last weekend, I was sharing with a group of children about God, and I found myself talking about faith. And it was one of those things that I hadn't fully planned out, so as I was saying it, I'm like, I hope this is okay. But I feel that I was telling the kids that without questions, we can't have faith. If something can be proved beyond a shadow of a doubt with complete certainty, that is not faith. Faith requires doubt and struggling and questions. And Hebrews 11 says this. It says, faith is being certain of what we hope for, or being sure of what we hope for and being certain of what we do not see. And that's been comforting for me because it's not always clear, but that doesn't mean that we're just floating out there without any uncertainty or without knowing. Our faith can ground us. Our faith in Jesus can give us certainty and direction, and it does. But it takes a process of discernment. It takes a process of humility and of diligently seeking God. So as we talk this morning about being a follower of Jesus, being a peacemaker in this election season, I want us to start from that place. That there's some ambiguity, there's some room to have different opinions. But as I said, I think we can still land on some clear takeaways. There are some things that we can be certain of. I've been thinking about this message a lot because at the beginning of the year, or the end of last year, we set up these sermon series. And just so it would happen, Jay, Lee, and I were both part of the sin series and the politics series. And so there are things I wanted to prepare for, right? I think we all prepare, but there were things that, there's a lot to these. There's a lot that people have emotional reactions to. And as I was trying to figure out, how does the Bible inform us in this arena, I got a little stuck. Because although there are multiple Old Testament characters that held positions of great influence in governments, and there are verses that talk about how we should position ourselves towards governments, and people ask Jesus straight out, do we pay taxes? I think it's very dangerous to draw a one-to-one parallel from those things to us today in 2024 in a secular representative democracy of over 300 million people in North America, 7,000 miles away from the land of Israel and Jesus, in the age of the internet, right? It's hard. We can't just say this, so this. We have to do a lot in between. And so this morning, we're going to try to do some of that a lot in between. So even though I just said it's dangerous, we're going to do it. And with God's help, we're going to do it responsibly. And we're going to do it in a way that is true to God's holistic heart. For the sake of time and flow, I am not going to read and cite to you every Bible verse. If you are someone who cares and wants to know, like, where did you get that from? I will be happy to send you my list and talk to you about it, but we would be here all day because I was trying to do a survey of principles that we can glean from the overarching message of the Bible of how we are to be as peacemakers in this time. So there's lots of references that informed these points I'm going to share. This is by no means a comprehensive list. There are many other principles, but I wanted us, again, with knowing that there's lots of ambiguity, I wanted to give us some things that we can hang our hats on and we can focus on. So the first principle this morning is that our hope is not in politics. In Colossians 1:16 through 17, we read, "For him, Jesus, all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together." Our ultimate confidence and hope have to be found in Jesus, who was before all things, who created all things, and who is currently in all things. As Jay explained last week, what happens in the political sphere matters. It matters for our lives and for the lives of our neighbors. However, we can't just pin all of our hopes on the results of political things being favorable to us or favorable to our neighbors. Our ultimate hope has to be in life with Jesus, in this current life and in the life to come. Hebrews 6 refers to this hope as an anchor for the soul. And if you're anything like me in the last, 10-ish years, I've really felt like I need an anchor in this political and socio-economical and social climate that we are in this country. So I think this hope allows us to engage in these political conversations with a different tone because we ultimately know how it's going to end. Our hope is in something bigger than what's going on right now. So with this hope as our grounding, we do not live by fear. That's the second principle that I want us to think about. And Psalm 46 is such a powerful reminder of when things get bleak, where we can turn to. So it's a little bit long, but we're going to read it. "God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea. Though its water roars and foams at the mountain, and the mountains quake with their surging. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy place where the Most High dwells. God is within her, she will not fall. God will help her at break of day. Nations are in uproar, kingdoms fall. He lifts his voice, the earth melts. The Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Come and see what the Lord has done, the desolations he has brought on the earth. He makes wars cease to the ends of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the shields with fire. He says, 'Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress.'" In the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, we're introduced to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, more commonly known by their Babylonian names of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These three Jewish men were captives in the land of Babylon, and they refused to bow to the Babylonian king, and so they were threatened to be thrown into a furnace to die. And before they were thrown in, they answered the king's taunting question with, our God can save us, but even if he doesn't, we are still not going to bow to you. So they stood with that. Now, I'm quite certain that they experienced fear. They were about to be thrown into a literal fire and be burned. But they didn't let their fear dictate their actions. Because their confidence was in something bigger, they stood by their hope in Jesus in the face of fear. I think that when we're free from that kind of fear, we can engage in all sorts of things without hate and without panic and without othering people, because our hope is not in what happens in those interactions. We have a higher peace a deeper peace that allows us to, while we experience fear, because it was legitimate to be afraid of to be burned to death, right? And so there are legitimate things in our world today and in the political atmosphere we're in that we should be fearful of. But we need to be mindful that that fear does not dictate our actions in a way that is unhealthy. So even if we don't live in this fear, we recognize that this morning we are all sitting in that democracy that I described earlier. And if you're a US citizen, you have the right to vote. And we live in a country that does value and protect free speech, which means we have the ability to question and openly disagree with our government. And so it becomes incredibly important for us to think about how do we do that? Because we do have this opportunity. As Jay said, we are the government. If you are a US citizen and you have the ability, you get to vote, which means you are part of the government. And so I think it's incredibly important that we remember that all people are made in the image of God, and all people are our neighbors. That's the next principle. So if you were here 2 weeks ago when our guest speaker, Carmen Imes, shared, she gave us a really great foundation and a framework to understand how all people are made in the image of God. And then that informs how we treat people. Because if all people are made in the image of God, no matter their character, no matter their personality, no matter their political persuasion or their actions, all people are made in the image of God, and all people are to be treated with dignity and respect and kindness because they are made in the image of God. This is really hard. It sounds good on a Sunday morning, but people act in really cruel ways. People hurt other people. People seek their own good at the expense of others. And these people are still God's image. Also, the marginalized, the ignored, the vilified, those people are God's image. And Jay mentioned last week that sometimes people can say, like, I don't care about politics. And I've heard people say, like, it's just too overwhelming, or it's too corrupt, it won't make a difference. I just stay out of it. But as Jay alluded to, and as I want to remind us this morning, for us to be able to say that, it shows that we have an incredible amount of privilege. Because many people cannot say that because the policies that happen affect their life. And there are some people, due to race, due to socioeconomic status, are a little bit above some of the effects of politics. But by and large, politics matter. It affects people's life. And Jay made that point last week, that we care about politics because it is a way to love our neighbor. And so I think it's really important that we keep in mind, even if we feel like it doesn't matter, it matters to someone. And because all people are made in the image of God, I think we have a responsibility to enter in and to love our neighbor, the neighbor that we have compassion for and kind of naturally care about, and the neighbor that we would rather avoid or worse. All are made in the image of God. So because we know that all people are made in the image of God, our aim must be to seek the good of others, often giving up our own rights. This is a theme all throughout the Bible, from the way the Israelites were called to be a light and a blessing and an example to the nations around them, to Jesus literally coming to earth as a human, to the early church meeting each other's needs through generosity and sacrifice. In Philippians 2, 1 through 11, this is articulated really clearly. Therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and of one mind. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Jesus Christ, who, being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that in the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. You may have noticed that we as Americans really like our rights. I think it's fair to say that we're a bit obsessed with them. Now, I want to be clear, I'm grateful for the rights we have in this country. And I recognize that many people have fought very hard so that, for example, I as a woman can vote. I am grateful for that. And I recognize the sacrifice and the importance of living in a country that values rights. The thing is, when our rights become the most important thing, we forget the way of Jesus. Because we just read that as God, he gave up that right to be killed by the people he created. So if that's our example, it's hard to hold on to too many rights at the expense of others, because God gave up everything, not just to hang out with people, but to be killed by them. So it's hard for me to think of any right that is more important than being God and being killed. I want to be clear that there are times, often, always, it is appropriate and necessary to protect ourselves and others from abuse and harm. When I say we give up our rights, I am not talking about abusive relationships, being physically, but children being abused. There is a line, a definite line. And I do not want you to hear that we as Christians just, things happen and it's fine. Our heart, though, needs to be to give up those things, to sacrifice for ourselves. But there are still times and places. Abuse is never okay. Violence is never okay. So I want to make that clear. Especially in this internet age, we need to be really wise and discerning. There is so much information coming at us all day, every day. We are constantly being told stories that prove that this person is amazing and this person is horrible. And the next day we hear a story that tries to convince us of the opposite. We often find ourselves in conversations that are super emotional and layered and complex. And it's really important that we're mindful of what we consume and how it is impacting our hearts. In the beginning of Romans 12, chapter 2, it starts with an exhortation to not be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of our minds. And in James 3, we read about true wisdom. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, spiritual, demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. So with the wisdom that God gives us, it is important that we act on what we believe. Again, this is a theme that we see throughout the whole Bible. The people of God are supposed to live in accordance with God's ways. We see this in the Old Testament with the Israelites being instructed to care for the orphan, the widow, and the foreigner, and to live by a different moral standard than those around them. Again, in James, we read, "What good is it, brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save them? Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, keep warm and well fed,' but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. But someone will say, 'You have faith, I have deeds. Show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith by my deeds.'" Jay shared last week that all laws are informed by values or have a moral root. He also shared that there is still a distinction between values and laws. And I've been reflecting a lot on this in the past week, because often when I'm talking with people and I get in a disagreement, especially with other Christians, I realize that we actually usually have the same value. We just have very different opinions about what we do in light of that value. We can often agree on what the problem is. We just cannot agree on how we solve that problem. And I think this is important because as we act on convictions that we have, I think we need to be mindful sometimes of like what's really happening, and it can de-escalate a situation and actually bring unity and like progress if we can come together on the things that we can come together on. And we might still disagree on the policy or the way it's acted out, but when we can remember that our values sometimes are the same, I think it can make a big difference. And this leads in to our final point. In a time of contention or conflict or strife, it should be inevitable that those of us who follow Jesus are known by a different spirit, literally the Holy Spirit. Again, like the other principles, this is seen all throughout the Bible. The people of God are constantly reminded that they are to be different than those around them. In James chapter 1, we read that we are to be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to get angry. Can you imagine what the world would look like if we all did that? If we were all a little quicker to listen, slower to speak, and slower to get angry. And don't let the frequency of 1 Corinthians 13 read in flowery ways at weddings deceive you. That's like a high calling. It talks about love. Love does not envy. It does not boast. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no records of wrongs. Just try for a week to try one of those with the people around you, right? That is a high call, but that is the call that God calls us to. It's hard to live in that, though, because there's so much hurt and brokenness and pain in our world. And it's so much easier, for me often, to just meet people where they're at. You want to be like that? I can also meet you there. I have had a couple situations in my life. The most prevalent one is in my office situation. I work with people, so they're people. And I find myself being sucked in to the negativity and the bitterness and the jealousy. And it's really easy to yeah, everyone's horrible. They all hate us. It's miserable here, right? And then I step back and I'm like, okay, this isn't really what's totally happening. And if I can react in a different way, it actually just makes me feel better about being where I am. And I do also believe that brings change to those environments. And so as Christians, I think all the time, but especially in a heightened time of division, we need to look different. We need to be known by the Spirit of God. And we can't do this just on our own strength or because we're super developed, mature people who have tried really hard. We do it because the Spirit of God is in us. In Galatians 5, we read about the fruit of the Spirit. And again, that list is it sounds good when it's little fruit shapes in a Sunday school classroom. But when you really think about living in this world with love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, that's so different than what we see. And that is what the Spirit in us can allow us to do as we submit ourselves to God and as we ask the Holy Spirit to have his way. This is hard to do, as I've said in multiple examples, and there are times when we get really discouraged and disheartened because if we are the ones who are always being patient and loving and gentle and faithful, it can feel like a losing battle, and it can feel like we're not making changes or standing up for ourselves or making an impact. And so I think it's important when we come to this place, which many of us might be there, or I have a feeling we might be in the next 3 to 6 weeks, that we remember the words that Jesus said to his followers in Matthew 11, verse 28. Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So we don't do this in our own strength. We don't do this for our own benefit. But we do it because this is the God that we follow. And this is what God has called us to do. When Carmen Imes was here a couple weeks ago during the lunch after church, she quoted a Croatian theologian and professor at Yale Divinity School. She said that he said, faithful Christians should be the most unreliable political ally. And I think this encapsulates a lot of what I'm trying to share this morning. We are unreliable political allies because our alliance is to Jesus. And he is bigger and doesn't play inside the rules of political parties or political candidates. And so we should not necessarily get so tied up that we are aligned with this person no matter what, because that's not the example we see in Jesus. So with our unreliable political alliances in mind, as a follower of Jesus, as a peacemaker in this election season, I encourage each one of you to participate. Educate yourself and advocate for others. If you have the ability to do so, vote. If you have a neighbor or a coworker or a family member who's hurting, listen to them and pay attention to their concerns. Fight for a right that has not yet come to pass. If you have a conviction that is from God, tell other people why it's important to you. And pray. Pray for what your heart seeks and pray for your enemies. It is my hope that as this body of believers following Jesus, we're able to do all of this and more, and that we keep in mind the words of the prophet Micah as we do so, that we are to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. In closing, I'm going to pray over us a prayer that was written by Kimberly Deckel, who's a pastor of a church in Texas. So if you would pray with me this closing prayer. Gracious and merciful Jesus, you spent time with those you knew would betray you, along with prostitutes, tax collectors, and others who were outcasts. We come before you asking for the ability to hear and consider the perspectives of those with whom we disagree. Root us in your word and cultivate in us the ability to compassionately and clearly articulate our convictions. Remove from us the need to prove our points and defend ourselves, and instead fill us with an overflowing grace. Enable us to look with tenderness upon the entire human family through your eyes, O Jesus. Amen.